This episode of Grilling JR with Jim Ross is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Behind the Human. I'm your host, Marc Champagne, and it's my job to unpack the stories and mental fitness practices of just people living at the top of their game personally and professionally. And today we have Elizabeth on the show. She is a journalist and applied behavioral scientist, blending science and storytelling. Her latest book, How to Fall in Love with Questions, A New Way to Thrive in Times of Uncertainty, invites readers to embrace life's big, unsolvable questions as guides rather than burdens. Who's saying there's any uncertainty in the world? Come on. Welcome to the show, Elizabeth. That's all we live in. It's craziness out there.
I know. And I had no idea the world that my book was going to be born into, but it certainly is something that undeniably is part of the zeitgeist right now, I gotta say.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, before we jump right in, just because I want to just ground all of us in the person behind the mic right now, and ask you, just if you eliminate the titles and all that kind of stuff, just who are you?
Yeah. So who am I? What a great question. I talk about these questions in the book. I give people a framework for categorizing different questions in your life. And this is the type of question, and I relate it to a fruit tree, parts of a fruit tree. And
Yeah.
we'll get into that later. But this is the type of question that I call a heartwood question. And heartwood is the type of the tree that stays with the tree for its entire life. It's the core of the tree that gives it its stability and balance. So this is a heartwood question, right? And I love it because the answer to it, it's never really answerable, right? But it comes with you
It
as you
evolves.
grow. It evolves.
Yeah.
And I have been thinking about, there's like even another question, like metaphor that has been striking me recently. And this is so random, so bear with me here, but I keep thinking about my identity as a lava lamp. and
Oh, I'd like to keep going.
and I don't know why this struck me recently, but it's for those of you that know what lava lamps are, remember that this is like a very old invention, but you have these like different like blobs that kind of go in and out and that you can see at different times, and it's constantly shifting. And so I feel like there are these parts of my identity too that are coming more into focus and less, and at this point in my life. And I would say right now, the parts of my identity that are really prominent are the ones that probably somewhat always are, but really right now I'm feeling like I am at my core, I am a writer. And that is how I experience the world. It's how I figure out what I think. It's how I connect to myself. It's how I ultimately show up for other people, because it's how I process everything that's going on. So writing is really it's such a huge part of who I am. And it relates to, I think, a lot of the virtues that I ground myself into, right? Like curiosity. I strive to be a curious person. I strive to be somebody who lives with humility and really like knowing what I don't know and writing into that. So I think that's really one big piece, my identity as a writer and a reader. And then the other one that I'll share that's very top of mind right now is my identity as a mother. I have a new-ish baby, almost 1 year old actually, so not so new anymore. But I think that's a really big part of how I'm seeing the world in this moment and the kind of parts of me that I'm bringing to everything that I do.
How do you think those two identities have been merging over the last little year?
So I think writing has given me the opportunity to more deeply reflect on the experience in a way that I don't know that I would have the tool to do that if it weren't for the practice that I've developed over time.
Yeah, I think really well said. I do see writing as a tool and, like you said, practice, because at the end of the day, and everyone, I think, writes in some capacity, even if they're not physically writing on a page or typing. But to me, it really links into journaling, which I just call reflection.
Yeah.
And it's a moment to think, right?
Totally.
And maybe sometimes empty out the mind and look at things from different perspectives. But at the end of the day, we're thinking, we're reflecting, and we're somewhat stilling the mind.
Yeah.
Which is what comes up over and over again as I study people around the world that have long passed as well. They all have practices to be able to think
Mhm.
and have some clarity of thought. And coming like full circle, right, to what we're talking about the world right now, it's really, if you're not intentional about it, it's really hard to actually do that in this busy, like content infused and ever changing landscape.
Absolutely. And one more thing I'll add to this is the book that I wrote and published this past spring is really at its core about how do we get unstuck from uncertainty. And, I think I start the book with one of my favorite definitions of uncertainty, which is a sense of doubt that stops or delays progress. And I think that really gets at the experience of uncertainty for a lot of people, which is it feels like you're paralyzed, right? And if you don't have
Yeah.
the answers, you can't move forward. And so I would say for me too, especially there's of course the uncertainty of our world. And then there's also the uncertainty of being a parent, which is tremendous, right? I think like any big life transition, whether it's becoming a parent or starting a new job or you're graduating from school or you're retiring, you're entering this world of unknowns. And so I think for me, having not only a writing practice, but something we can talk about a little bit later, a questions practice, and having this guided
Yeah.
reflection of more deeply understanding the questions that I'm asking in this moment has helped me not only navigate this period of uncertainty in my personal life, but also more broadly as well.
Yeah, we're definitely going to talk about questions. This is a language that you and I share, and I think really geek out about. And on that note, I did have a question for you, and that's just was there a moment, or are there moments where you realize that let's just call it the language of questions really started to change your life in a way?
Yeah, definitely. And I would love to hear your answer to this too, as somebody that shares my love of questions. But I would say for me, questions were really in the water for me growing up. So my parents were both journalists. And as journalists, questions are currency, right? If you're a
Yeah.
journalist and you ask the right question, you open up a new story and it's an incredibly powerful tool. But I didn't really start appreciating questions not only in my professional life as a journalist and an applied behavioral scientist, but in my personal life too, until I was going on dates in Washington, D.C., and I was in my mid 20s. And I experienced this strange phenomenon. And I'm not sure if you have, or maybe you know people who have had this experience, but I would go on these dates, and the men that I was dating, they would not ask me a single question for the entire date. And it was just so confounding, I think, especially as somebody who kind of lives and breathes questions for work, to go
Yeah.
through an entire conversation and you're like, you're not curious at all, like, what's going
Yeah.
on?
Yeah.
And I would leave the date and they would text me like, that was so great. We've got to meet up again. I was like, how did you enjoy that? It was so one-sided. That started me off on this path to being not just a user of questions as a journalist, but as a student of questions. And so I started to really study the research on questions and discovered, as you well know, Mark, that questions are an interpersonal superpower, right? And not just that, a professional superpower, right? They unlock relationships and opportunities across our lives. And yet we live in a culture that valorizes answers, right? And champions people often who can spew confident sounding answers rather than people that are really thoughtful about their questions. So I became really interested in questions and in researching them and writing about them. But it wasn't until I had this experience in my personal life that I really converted from an intellectual interest to something I had to write a book about. And that was, I think, like many people, I had during the pandemic was facing a lot of uncertainty. And for me, it came in two flavors. So the first was I had recently gotten married and I was questioning whether my relationship was the right one. I was questioning, was this the right person? Should I get a divorce? The other big uncertainty that I was facing was I had recently left my job to pursue a creative project that also felt like it was failing. And I was really asking this question of what am I doing with my life? And so
Yeah.
in both cases, very scary, big questions. And ultimately, it was around this time that I read Letters to a Young Poet by the poet
Mm.
Rainier Maria Rilke. And for those who are familiar with Letters to a Young Poet, It's a book of correspondence between this poet Rilke and an aspiring poet, Franz Capus, from the early 20th century. And this is writing to Rilke and asking him lots of questions about how to live his life. And Rilke very famously responds to him not with an answer, but by telling him to, quote, love the questions themselves as if they were locked rooms and books written in a very foreign tongue. And Marc, I'm curious how that lands with you. But for me, I loved this idea. And yet, in that moment in my life, I had never been further from loving the questions of my life. These questions of, should I get a divorce? What am I doing with my life? They felt so heavy and so scary. And so the book was really an attempt to try to understand, how do we start to love the questions of our lives, especially in a culture, in a context in which so many of us have become addicted to fast, easy answers. And so it's really bringing together
Yeah.
behavioral science and philosophy and art and history to try to explore that question.
Yeah, I know. I think just especially just knowing how you open the book, those are big questions. And I think a lot of people, myself included, get really scared of what's the answer there. Whether sometimes you know the answer, and that's scary in itself. And then it becomes this thing of usually the follow up question that I ask in a situation like that is like, what am I pretending not to know?
Mm,
Because this eventually you're going to have to deal with it.
yeah.
Right. And it's like whether you somewhat deal with whatever the situation is on your own terms by posing the big question, or you get to this like wall where life starts to explode. And now you're dealing with it in this like really can be chaotic way. And it's not just relationships, but like work moves, all these different things, health. There's a million different avenues that where that shows up. And it's so I'm curious. And yeah, I guess I'm curious to see, for those obviously who haven't read the book yet, like, how did you have the courage to actually ask the question and go sit? I remember the scene, you painted it really well in the intro, like getting out of bed, and like I could feel the anxiety there. And then I think you said something to or asked your question, or sorry, said something to your husband about we need to chat or need to talk. Like, how did you get to that point?
Yeah, it is. I think for me, and I wonder how many folks who are listening have had this experience, it was almost something that I think you live with uncertainty for long enough, or you live with a question for long enough, that there comes a point where you feel like you have to do something. This question doesn't leave you alone. It's keeping you up at night, right? Senses that it's eating you alive, right? And you feel like, I have to find an answer to this. I have to do something because it's so uncomfortable to be sitting in this uncertainty. And so for me, I reached that point after really not just months, but I would say years of feeling doubt in my relationship. And I talk in the book, I walk folks through the journey of my relationship and how I reached that point with my partner where I was questioning whether we should be together. And I think it was, it's interesting kind of that you bring up courage, because I think it was, in a way, perhaps there was courage there. It also to me felt like an act of desperation, because
Mm.
I was felt like I could no longer carry this question alone, and that is what I had been trying to do. And I think sometimes we reach that point, and there's a lot of my book that's about answering this question of, how do we sustain our relationship to questions over time, particularly the questions that are really painful and really hard. And a big way that we can do that is through community, through relationships. That sometimes we can hold our questions and love them and live them on our own, but oftentimes we need other people. And in this case, my question was telling me, it was speaking to me that it needed to be released. And looking
Mhm.
back, I don't know that was necessarily the right way to do it. And I talk about that and the fallout in the book, but ultimately sometimes if I think part of a questions practice is listening to your questions, right? And what are they telling you,
Yeah.
and what are they telling you that you need in that particular moment?
Well, it sounds like of course, I don't want to give away everything in the book, but the book does open with that scene, as you mentioned. But then even before that, your dedication reads to my mom, dad, husband, and son, my love for you is never in question. So you've obviously come in a long way in that journey. When I read that as well, I'm like, oh, it's nice. I think it infuses hope that these are tools and this is a universal language that we all have access to, that you can deploy it and use it in ways that work best for you, no matter where you're at right now in your own life, right?
Definitely. And I think I'll say that a big part of what allowed my husband and I to make the journey from that place where we were questioning whether to be together to a place where, of course, our relationship isn't perfect, right? But I think we have really transformed the way that we communicate with each other. We are on such kind of different and more solid ground at this point. And a big reason for that is the approach to questions and inquiry that we've taken.
Yeah.
And really for me, a big part of it was through a questions practice, learning to ask a different question of our relationship. And it sounds really simple, right? But I think it's actually quite profound. And to give a concrete example, right? I open up the book with this question of, should we get a divorce, right? But one of the things that I learned was that really wasn't the right question to be asking. And it wasn't a
Mhm.
great question for many reasons. One of them is that it's a binary, right? It's a, should we get a divorce? Yes or no? I realized that I don't like either of those answers. I don't want to get a divorce. So yes didn't feel right, but no also didn't feel right because it doesn't acknowledge the challenges that are still there and the change that we might need to undergo. And so for me, I ended up changing the question, right? Or we ended up changing the question together to, how might we stay together, right? Or what does it look like for us to be in a sustained relationship with each other? How does that, what are the types of practices, right? That, and how might we both change in order to be in a relationship together? So these
Yeah.
are the types of questions that can open you up to more answers, to more possibilities in your life, and can be really profound in terms of the impact that they have on you and on your relationships.
How did you frame up? Because there's probably many people just knowing just general divorce rates, right? Or at least in North America, it's something like 50%. We can make some assumptions with this audience, and myself included, of course, that these are questions on people's minds. And even if it's not that, just let's just pick a situation for anyone listening where it's like a big deal for you, right? Maybe it's a big job change
Yeah,
or like a location move or something or whatever. How did you ease into or set the context or set the environment so that you can actually pose some of these questions in a way that doesn't shut the other person down or fly off into this really hostile territory? 'Cause I feel like there's some pre-work there or some sort of framing that needs to happen,
definitely.
including in a job setting, right? If you think of challenging maybe question your conversations with your boss or your colleagues or so forth.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I will also say, just as a caveat, I'm by no means saying that everybody through different questions should decide, oh, I'm not going to get a divorce. If you're dealing with that's really hard and that's really painful. And I think there are definitely some times when maybe the question, should we get a divorce? That's the right question for you. And the right answer is
Yeah.
no. And so it's all, of course, so individual. So much of it is your own personal discernment. But the point that I'm trying to make is that it can often be really helpful to understand what question you're asking and then doing the work through. I have a bunch of prompts in the book about developing a questions practice and trying to understand, is the question that I'm asking the right one for me? And so that often that can help, but I definitely want to make that clear that I'm not trying to say that my choice is the right choice for everyone. With that said, to your question about creating environments, I think one of the things that I learned about this, and it doesn't always work, right? I think to your point, it's whenever you're engaging with another human, there's a lot that's out of your control. So you can do everything you can to create a particular environment. You can frame things differently. You can do all of these things. And maybe the other person doesn't hear you or it doesn't land the way you want. And it doesn't necessarily mean you've done something wrong, but that it's messy. It's messy when we're communicating
Yeah.
about challenging things. That said, one of the things that I learned actually from the Quaker community, and one of the people that I interview and profile in the book is Parker Palmer, and he
Mm.
spent many years as part of a Quaker community. And talks really beautifully about the practice of open and honest questions. And they have these committees where he was living where people come together around a particular challenge that somebody in the community is facing. And the work of the community is to ask truly open and honest questions. And that sounds straightforward and easy, but it's actually really hard because you realize how often your instinct when somebody is sharing a challenge with you is to give them advice, right? Or to ask, have you considered seeing a therapist or something that's advice cloaked in something
Mhm.
else, right? And I think one thing that I have learned is the importance of really thinking about, is my question an open and honest one, or do I have an agenda, right? Do I already know the answer to my question and I'm just getting the other person to try to answer it, right? Is there some unintentional manipulation there? And so I do think
Sure.
that position and feeling of humble inquiry is one that people can pick up on and can go a long way in creating that type of space.
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like just the power of community or having access to some sort of community to work through these bigger situations and kind of stress tests. I guess what you're thinking about or getting honest, like non-judgment type inquiry, like has been helpful, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I also think thinking about when it comes to what like creating those environments where people don't feel defensive and maybe they're more open to hearing you, less your role is less maybe as a director but more as somebody who's accompanying someone else. And so that was one of the other lessons that I learned in particular from the folks that I talked to who really created communities around helping people deal with and navigate big uncertainty in their life. And particularly,
Yeah.
I profiled a couple of women who've developed these like koan salons. So folks are familiar with Zen koans. They're these
Mhm.
enigmas, questions, paradoxes that are millennia old from Buddhist tradition. And a big part of these Zen koan salons where people discuss these koans is the idea of we're going to accompany each other through what's hard,
Yeah.
not to try to give advice or direct the experience of someone else. So I think those are kind of principles I think that can be helpful because we enter sometimes these situations, whether it's at work or with people who we love, where we're feeling nervous, we're feeling threatened. And from that sense of threat and nervousness, I think comes that instinct to take control. And not only the control of us, but of their experience too. And I think that's sometimes where the tension can come up. And not to say that all tension
Yeah.
is bad, right? But I think that's where maybe things can go off the rails.
It's just, I think there's no shortage of challenges when it comes to just community and loneliness in the world or
Yeah.
society that we're living in right now. That the more that I study some of the ancient figures of the past, and Rainer is one of them, thanks to you, actually. I've had a few chats with him using AI, and it's been unbelievable.
So cool.
But it's becoming so clear how those cultures and all of these different teachers and wisdom holders and so forth conversed and chatted with people, chatted with themselves as well. And I think that's another way to use questions and obviously journaling and so forth versus like shutting down. And I think that's where you're getting at as well. Like for me personally, I have a long-standing men's group that
Mm.
it's been just I can't imagine not having those guys in my life because to your point, there's at least the way this one's structured, and most are, it's structured from a place of safety, confidentiality, and no judgment.
Yeah.
And like you said, you're not there to fix, and I can ask for advice, but often the questions that are coming back are reflections
Mm.
as well of like your share, what's going on. And I can feel your tension. And is it coming from here? It just, and then you start to talk through it. Right. And I do the same thing too. Like when we're not meeting with those, you can kind of set up I mean, this might be a bit controversial right now, but it's been super helpful for me. But setting up an AI council of someone like Rainer and others, because they give you other perspectives and other questions to think about it. And you're not alone, is my point. And I think you don't want to like over index on these people that are no longer here, but I so far have found no downside to having those conversations and trying to mix both, in at least in my life personally and professionally. And it's all questions.
I
It's
love
all
that.
questions,
I'm
right?
curious, how did you come to love questions and be as passionate about them as you are?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm in the process of actually really thinking through that. I know high level and because I'm working with someone to refine some of the speaking work that I'm doing, and he's asking me these questions
Mm,
around like when did it all start? And for me, it started as a young boy, essentially around 8 years old, that I had an uncle that would visit from out of town periodically, and I'll never forget, like, he would get me up at 5:30 in the morning, which for even some people today is an ungodly hour, but definitely for an 8-year-old child. And I'll never forget, like, I'm in Canada, so anyone listening, you might have heard of our classic Tim Hortons coffee shops. That was our thing. We would go, I'm in his car, it's still dark outside, it's cold normally, and he would just ask me questions
mm,
like, "Have you called your grandmother lately?" I'm like, "Yeah, no, I haven't," or like, "How's school going?" Just constant they're like good life questions, and now that I think back to that, I think that's what instilled this whole curiosity in me, but then it really didn't re-spark until I made questions my job and
mm,
creating the journaling app and so forth, and got to the point where I realized that a question can literally change your life,
mm.
and when I was in a deep depression and we had to shut that app down, it was the gentleman, Chip Conley, who just flipped me an email back after me asking for advice, and he said, "What do you want for your life?"
Mm,
It's all he had in the email. And I'll never forget it because if I ask that question today, it's a good little check-in, but in the moment, it literally paused a really bad loopy narrative
yeah.
of, like I said, sliding into a really hopeless place and brought back some hope. I'm like, "Okay, if this is what I want,
Yes.
then, what's next?" And ever since then, it's gotta get this out there.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the key things that I talk about in some of the prompts that I share for a questions practice is knowing, how to know when a question is the right question. Is it opening up lots of possibilities for your life? Does it feel like it's moving
Yeah.
you forward? Or does it feel like it's keeping you stuck in the past or in a pattern of rumination and regret? And going back to the tree analogy that I was talking about earlier, I talk about those questions as like the dead leaf questions, right? And the questions that
Yeah.
you should just
Yeah.
release. But I love that you found this question that, to quote a one of the Zen Buddhist practitioners that I interviewed for the book, a great question blows the windows and doors off a room, right? And just this idea that it opens everything up. All of a sudden, you can see outside of whatever box you've put yourself in. I love thinking about questions in that way and how amazing that you had that experience.
I think the other thing though that surfaces really high quality questions or well-timed questions for people personally is when your mind is clear and you
Mm,
have the mental real estate to like let that come through because like, they're all there, but it again, like living in the world that we live in, it's easy to just pack the mind like
yeah.
floor to ceiling with stuff that it's hard for any of that to come through. So I wonder for you personally, and then also just through some of your interviews and your research, what's been like, what are some of your mental fitness
Mm.
practices that help keep your mind clear or during times of high stress and tension to reset and not allow your mind to just keep packing in the clutter? And we're not we're human, we're not perfect on that, but it's a work in progress. But what are some things that have helped you?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I'll go back to actually one of the researchers who I profiled for the book, Sarah Schnitger. And she
Mm,
is, I credit her with reintroducing patients research into psychology and really spending much of her career trying to understand what is the role of patience and cultivating the virtue of patience in living a good life and our well being. And I bring this up because I think when you talk about how do we prevent that kind of mental clutter and noise and how do we sift through the noise of the world, I think about her research because what it really does is, I think, through a deeper understanding and study and kind of cultivation of patience, we're able to see the times in our life when we're, of course, impatient, but when we would be served by slowing down. And I think what that does is it allows you to see and sift through all of the things that are coming in, right?
yeah.
Whether it's information that you're consuming or whether it's the thoughts that you have, right? the more you're slowing down everything, you're slowing down your body, you're slowing down your thinking, the more you're able to, I think, exercise that kind of discernment in deciding, is this a thought that is serving me? Is it not? Do I want to hold on to this? Is this a question that I want to ask? And I've found that just a very simple kind of integrating, she and I write much more in depth about this in the book, but trying to integrate more opportunities to cultivate patience into my life, even if it's reflecting on a walk. I do a lot of walking, and walking, I would say, is one of the big ways that contributes to mental fitness. But just reflecting, is there something that I could do more slowly today? And what is that?
Yeah, that's great.
And or maybe it's something that I've been trying to do, actually, is I've been trying to write slower by hand. And my journaling practice, usually I write at night. And I was noticing that I was getting frustrated because I have horrible handwriting. It's completely illegible. Like, I should be a doctor, but I'm not.
Yeah, yeah.
And one of the reasons that it's so illegible is because I think faster than I write. And so I'm like, I wish I was a faster writer, whatever. I'm a very fast typist, which has served me well. But
Yeah.
I started to experiment with, what if I wrote slower? What would that be like? And so I started to write more patiently, more slowly, to try to write legibly, and found, like, lo and behold, the quality of my thinking changed. And I felt more relaxed and at ease, and I was able to relate differently to my thoughts and ideas. And so I do think that, speaking to this broader question of how do we deal with the noise and I think a big part of it is the pace, right? It's this sense of urgency. It's like there's so much coming at us. It's coming at us really quickly. And there's this sense that, like, we have to process it all now and it's all important. And so I think, to me, this practice of patience, however you can integrate that into your daily life, again, even if it's, I'm going to take some bites of my breakfast a little more slowly and look around the room. Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be big, but that can have a meaningful effect in just bringing your awareness a little bit more to the crazy speed, I think, that we're all living our lives at, that isn't necessarily always conducive to mental fitness.
It's so good. I love it. I'm gonna borrow that journaling practice because I'm similar and notice the speed at which I'm writing. And yeah, and I think what's really important in terms of what you said is for everyone listening, and myself included, to just look at what you're already doing and looking at your average days and so forth, to your point around, like, maybe just slowing down when eating, or if when you're preparing meal, like, you don't have to have the news on or a podcast playing, or like just actually slowing down and being present with the environment, and just figuring out what's already in your routine and intentionally select a couple of those things. And it's like, what would this look like if I was a little bit slower,
Totally.
and just run the experiment.
Yes. And I will say, Mark, that I am like the queen of speed. So I write in the book about how hard this has been for me because, and I recount, and I won't give this away, but I recount some very dramatic experiences in my life where, like, almost, like, I would call a couple of them like near death, actually, experiences, because of a lack of patience and moving too fast and trying to do too many things at once. And so I relate so much to people listening to this who are just like, nope, not for me. I want to
Yeah, yeah,
speed through. I get it. And it's really hard. And it can be transformational when you're able to,
yeah,
bit by bit, integrate it into your life.
yeah. So someone picks up the book, they go through it. What's your hope or desire when they put it down?
My greatest aspiration for the book was that it would be a companion for people who are going through hard transitions in life. So whether that's you're questioning your relationship, your career, you're retiring, you're entering the workforce after graduating from a program, or maybe you're just feeling stuck and you don't really know why, but you're trying to figure out how to bridge this question of, who was I before and who am I now? Maybe it's an injury,
Yeah,
right, or an illness. I would love for this book to be a support for people during those moments, and not necessarily as, hey, this book has all the answers, but this is a book that can hopefully share some insights and help to guide you in those moments where we feel really lost and alone and scared, right, by the uncertainty that we're facing. But I think beyond that, my hope is that this book changes the way you think about questions in your life, if you think about them at all. I think a lot of times we don't really even notice or think about these big questions. And that once you are starting to think about those questions, that they become your companions as well, and that you start to really connect with them differently, maybe through a questions practice. But when you think about any relationship that we have, whether it's to a significant other or to a friend, the key to a relationship growing and surviving is you have to spend time with that person. And so, in the same way, I would invite people to start spending time with your questions and start to hold them and get curious about them. And I think what I've seen, and from the many people that I interviewed for the book, it truly can change the way that you see the world, change the way that you are living your life, to start to live and love the questions, in the words of Rilke.
Very well said. And I think you can give yourself a bit of a pat on the back for that one. I think you've achieved a lot of those desires, at least for myself going through the book. It's really well written. I love the mix of people from the past like Rainer, but then modern day individuals. Even we didn't talk about her, but I don't know if you know this, but Mariana Jamadi, she's been on the show like when it first
Okay.
started, probably 6 years ago. I'm like, oh my God, it's a small world. There's
Amazing.
just my point is there's a beautiful mix of present day individuals and experts from the past and so forth, and of course frameworks and ways to leverage these questions. Yeah, and thank you for writing the book, and probably a higher thank you for asking that first question when you got out of bed and slowly approached your husband, because of course that wasn't easy, but it seems like that decision led to something like this in the book, and for you to pursue this topic. And now the ripple effect of that is more than just you and your husband. It's in your family. It's many people. So thank you.
I so appreciate you saying that. And I appreciate all of your thoughtful questions and the opportunity to talk today. So thank you for reading it, and for such a wonderful conversation.